for sticking very well to time over lunch. I hope those of you on screen had a lavish lunch as well. Lucy, item 10, violence against women and girls delivery plan.
Okay, so this is a bit of a high-level overview of the work which is going on in the force, which is very extensive, and I'll probably just pull out some bits and then maybe ask Alistair to talk to it, because the advantage of Alistair starting is that A's taken over as the gold in terms of the delivery, but it's meant that we've been able to have a review of the plan that we've got from somebody who's come in, so that's been great. So some key bits, if I go through the performance, so I have put the detection rate down there for, which is currently at 11%. So my view is that needs to be significantly better if we're going to build the confidence with the community as a whole, but also confidence of our victims to come forward and report. That actually does place us in terms of being, I think, we're the third best performing force in the country. It's 11%. So just to give you some context around that, but way off where certainly Alistair and I would want the force to be and where we intend to take the force. But we do, I touched on this slightly earlier on, we are going to need to make some bold choices. We've got investigators investigating everything, and we do need to make some very clear choices to prioritise our resources. And as I've put here, you know, we need to make sure we're tackling the crimes that pose the most harm, recognising that we've also got, you know, crimes that will cause disruption. So it's not to say we won't tackle those, but there are some, frankly, that actually the output doesn't warrant the investment into it. Officer identification and public legitimacy. So the warrant cards, in my view, look like they're printed on the 1980s computer system. They don't reflect the security that we want them to give the public, but also that they're just not professional, in my view. Lots of issues with the holders as well. You know, there's a flap that covers the name that needs to go. It's not braille, so it's not it doesn't reflect the diversity. And some bits that I've put on there in terms of holographic coding, braille augmentations, verification chips. You know, these are all standard practice. So Simon is leading a piece of work which is to issue new warrant cards and staff cards. My point around the warrant cards are they should not be viewed as a door access facility. They are a power to deprive somebody of their liberty, which is the actual probably the biggest thing that we can give to people. So that's a piece of work, and the cost is consumable within the current budget. Officer verification. So you'll see there were various different approaches from various different forces to this. Some which I agreed with, some which I thought were different. And actually, what needs to be at the heart of this is that it's I'll put here. It's the responsibility of the officer to reassure the member of the public that they are a police officer. So it's not, and nor should it be the other way round. So we brought in we took the best of everything that we saw that was out there, brought in a process. It was introduced in October, and we've had one person push for verification for the officers. So, you know, we've not got swathes of people pushing that, which is reassuring in one way, but doesn't necessarily test the system. Communication and management information. So internal communication, there's going to be a rebranding of our reporting system to be Speak Up. This is being supported by lots of activity that's going on in the force, but we're just making a very clear statement that there is no place for violence of women against BTP, and that we'll need to continuously challenge ourselves to make sure that we're delivering the best service to victims whilst tackling offenders at the same time. But that's victims within the organisation as well as externally. And when I talk about victims internally, you know, a small amount of occasions we have got victims who are victims of behaviour from other employees, but also I was quite struck by in some of the conversations that we've been having is how we have got women who are victims of sexualised behaviour just in terms of their commute, and actually we employ, so making sure that we support those. External communications and engagement, so a joint BTP, RDG and Crime Stoppers campaign was launched in August, promoting a zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment and violence against women and girls. I have to say I'm a bit disappointed with industry. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the adoption of signage and support for that. Some operators have really stepped into it and embraced it, and others, it's like a campaign doesn't exist, and I think it's a mixed bag. Had conversations with DFT, with Peter Wilkinson about it. I just still don't think it's where it needs to be. The announcements, disappoints me when I come into the station and it tells me at the final point about 61016, and just think, the line can be a little bit lonely. Why hasn't it told me earlier on? And I think the lack of signage at stations and on trains in some areas, I just feel quite disappointed by that, but we'll continue to try and push and influence as much as we can. I don't know if anyone wants to pass a comment on that particular bit, but it's definitely a challenge for us.
Anybody anything to say? Great.
Just on the signage, there's been an audit of where it can very quickly rectify that, where there is no signage or poor signage.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a push to the tops where there is an absence of signage. Obviously, they've got a commercial challenge with their advertising space, but I think certainly on the tops, in terms of their contracts and their franchise agreements, they have to put 61016 for CT purposes. They haven't embraced the need for us to reach out to the public to embrace it for violence against women and girls.
Okay, and just as a supplementary on regards to the warrant card, how does it differ from the one that you had from Metropolitan Police?
So the Met have just done a relaunch of warrant cards as well, so it will be more aligned to the new product in the Met.
The same?
The same, yeah. If not some slight additions to it, but it won't be any less than the Met one.
Okay, so in terms of procurement, it's a fairly straightforward request of a standard warrant card for a police officer. You mentioned April, so when do you think the whole force would be issued with?
Simon, do you want to commit? I've been a bit pushy with Simon with the timeframes because it feels slower than we would like it to be.
See where I'm coming from, because it's a standard product issued to police forces.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, obviously the dissemination of it. So again, it's not just chuck it in the post and it goes to an officer. So there has to be a whole process of receiving the old one back.
From a supplier point of view, though, it's a fairly straightforward.
It is. Simon, do you want to just come in on this point?
Yeah, it is, Graham. So what we've done is we've baselined, what is it we want the card to do in terms of the capabilities. What have other forces like the Metropolitan Police got? So we've looked at that. We've taken advice from GCHQ and others in terms of what's the sort of market leading. We have looked at commercial framework. We were looking originally at direct award, but we are going for a framework. We've confirmed that the suppliers on the framework can meet that spec. And then there's I think it's a 6-week design phase, which the provider, once awarded, needs to work through. And that's probably the longest pole in the tent in terms of the timeline. So, so the quicker we can deliver it, the quicker we will, really.
So when would you say that all officers will be equipped with a new warrant card, Simon?
Well, I think what you've got there is an outline date. What we haven't yet got is the selected provider. So we just need to work with that selected provider, Graham, and then lay out the detailed logistic delivery timeline, so we can do it as quickly as we can.
Presumably, Simon, just a question from me in terms of the 43 forces of England and Wales, a lot of whom will be looking at their warrant cards to make sure they're up to spec given things that have happened. Presumably there's only a limited amount of security printing capability in the country, so there might be delays on that. Is that a possibility?
I mean, it might be a possibility, Rod. It's not something which in the sort of testing with the various suppliers that's been flagged up to date. So it may be an issue, but it's certainly not something which has has been represented as a concern back to us.
Okay, thank you. Martin, then Andy.
It's more on Lucy's general points about train operating companies and take up. And we're back to communication and marketing, I think, in a way, and I appreciate, you know, that that's more, as much science as it is an art, and I think it's tricky for all of us, but by contrast, when we were talking about masks and so on, anecdotally, you know, the amount of times I was told yesterday on my travel here, another anecdote from coming to London for the day, by the train operating companies announcers, you must be wearing a mask all the time. I appreciate they are two vastly different issues, wearing a mask and COVID and violence against women, but they have that communication potential if they wanted, it seems to me, and it's
Yeah, so I think it's
how we engage and how we work together.
Yeah, so I think there's been lots of engagement. I don't know whether Oliver or Andy was on the line as well, but there's been lots of engagements and lots of reassurance that it's not manifesting itself. I mean, the reality is today, I mean, the perversity is you probably sit there and comply with your maths, but you might be sitting over opposite a predatory sex offender, and nobody's telling you how to reach out and gain support. So there is a juggling act, and there's lots of different research that people say about multiple messages and stuff like that. But you know, if you're a lone female traveller and there's I mean, you know, somebody was telling me the other day, you know, they've got in an empty carriage late in the evening on a quite a remote line, and you know, guy comes and sits opposite them, and the whole train's empty. We want that person to know that if they're feeling uncomfortable, that they can.
I think it's quite telling that most people have heard about the 6-1 through social media, where there's been incidences which people have reported on and said, and the response from BTP was fabulous. Then there's a whole line of stuff in the post saying, that's a really useful number, I didn't know that existed. So there's multiple channels to get this out, isn't there? And it's just making sure that we
Through
do.
unfortunate circumstances, the last week we have to. So when I was on Eddie Nesta recently, he did ask me what I could have more of, which was influencers not seeking payment to get the message out.
Yeah.
A couple of them did do it, but equally we had one who was a victim, and she's talked about it. I mean, she's had under 2 million, just under 2 million sort of engagements with it. So you are right, with the number of people that say they haven't heard about it, it's quite significant.
I think one of the points about 61016 is historically and traditionally it's been associated with counter-terrorism.
Yeah.
And it's broadening out the report any crime. 61016.
Yeah, I think one of the, the Adele's still on, I think one of the challenges now for train operating companies and getting the campaign wide and more visibility is the fact that I think a lot of the advertising space has been sold to companies rather than by the train operating companies. The ability to influence know what goes on by way of advertising is more limited. I think that's one of the challenges we face around boards, signage, and everything else. And with that said, I went to Birmingham week before last, and there was fairly significant signage around the campaign, so that was quite impressive. But of course, it's not standardised. That is one of the challenges around the space that's available.
Andy,
Yeah, the space thing has always been there, but I mean, the big contract was led at privatisation, and that screened off most of it, and most of the other stuff was quite short term and small, I imagine. But I mean, I got on the running in a train the other day and walked all the way through, and there was a different poster in every coach. And I think it's one of the things at the moment, there are so many things that train operators need to do to guard themselves against people getting injured and all the rest of it, whether it's mind just stepping. The white noise that's out there now is just phenomenal. And if you announced everything between every station that you theoretically could announce, you know, people will just get better from one distance on. So it's very difficult. And I think when it comes to the presentation of things, it really depends on, you know, whether somebody in the organisation is quite passionate about it. And that's not uniform, is it, by definition? But I think the other thing that sometimes a concern, it goes back a long way. Thieves operating this car park, brackets, don't park here, don't travel by train. So you've got to be careful how you do the message, really, because I remember when that happened to me, we turned it round and a crime prevention initiative instead. And I think, you know, most people, and this is not to undermine the important work that this initiative is doing, but the stats in the survey, if people honestly answer honestly, is that 85, 87, 88% of people on trains, and it's a lot of 4 times the population of the UK every year prior to this, travel are quite happy, it would appear. And therefore, sometimes it's difficult to get traction even with the department because they say, "Wow, look at this! You know, people are telling us actually they feel great on trains and so on." So I think it is very difficult. I think the white noise issue, the way in which it's presented, and so on. There. So I think one of the posters says, "Is somebody looking at you oddly or something?" One of the.
That's actually where we have had a lot. Seem to be getting more confidence, which is, you know, the person comes and sits opposite you and just staring at you on the train, you know,
Yeah.
and that's, I suppose, people's feeling of safety. I mean, what we do know is around about 75 to 80% of victims of unwanted sexual behaviour don't report it.
Yeah, I understand.
So, I mean, we've got some way to go to get the confidence around it. But, you know, I mean, we'll seek to try and influence as much as we.
But I think the other thing that's been lost really with AutoGates and all the rest of it is, you know, the train managers going through spending time with customers. It just doesn't happen much now. And, you know, when I ran Liverpool Street, Norwich, the guys used to go through, and if you saw something like that, you know, they would say, "Are you okay? Can I move you somewhere?" and all this sort of stuff to actually manage the train.
Yeah.
And I think that's gone away because automation and, you know, different forms of ticketing and so on have reduced the amount of interaction and the need to know around, and that's really quite sad.
Yeah.
Okay, just a quick one.
Sorry, Graham.
Sorry, just a quick one, just but not to labour the point, but at Euston, they have stand-up advertising, movable things, coffee shop, for example, for one of the new ones in. Could we have a BTP one, which you could sort of have the messaging for the week type thing and have a rolling thing that could be positioned in a place that when we're all stood looking at the train times, that they're quite prominent, and they're mobile. The private sector advertisers can do it in concourse, why not the BTP?
Yeah, we can. I mean, I do think there is some pretty big signage up there, because I'm sort of like, well, Network Rail, if I look at your big sign there that has the latest Boohoo advertisement, you know, for like 5 seconds, putting up the 61816 and everything, I sort of feel that there is a responsibility on others rather than us having to plug the gap.
Yeah.
And we need to do it on a macro level.
Yeah, because when you look at, when I travel, most of us travel, we travel during business days, so it's a very busy, but I can imagine late at night, which I don't really travel at, I can imagine it's very upsetting for vulnerable females, and that's the target audience, that when you do travel late at night, you are reassured.
And unfortunately, you know, we still know that bystander interaction in this is not where it wants to be. You know, that call to arms to the public to say, don't just get off the carriage and move to another carriage because you're finding it all a bit awkward. Then you text us on 61916. It's not just about victims having to, or vulnerable people having to curtail or change their behaviour. This is a call to bystanders who have chosen other ways of dealing with uncomfortable behaviour. I mean, you know, there are some really good examples. If I just maybe a couple of these we've already touched on in terms of the initiatives and projects, but we have launched an anonymous reporting system. So this is just really will help us to have more intelligence. So you can report anonymously, so the victim won't be identifiable, but that will enable us to potentially look at some of those cases just to see if we can identify by other methods that person. And equally, you might obviously have repeated contact about the same individual, and of course, you know, all the CCTVs across the network, particularly, you know, 20,000 cameras in London, we may well still be able to achieve the right outcome. The culture and professional standards. So obviously internally focusing, as I think I've mentioned before, we've had a review of all of our PSD cases. We've had one anyway, but obviously with Alistair starting and leading as the appropriate authority, there's been an opportunity for Alistair to relook at some of those cases. Since I think our last meeting, there's one officer for a misconduct with a sexual nature that has been sacked in a fast track process, and another one we've appealed for a judicial review, and we won the first stage of that, which is to say that we can have a judicial review, and that's another one which has got sexual offending associated around it. And currently we've got 30 officers on suspension or being investigated for sexual offences or sexual misconduct. One of the things is about improving victim support, not only externally, but also, as I said earlier, in terms of our internal victims. I think it's sometimes a bit of a danger that they don't historically necessarily get the same service that we give externally. So we're partnering with some charitable groups in relation to that. And then the vetting review, we reached a position. So Tracy, who can't be here today, but Tracy has worked with PSD just to look at the vetting, our approach to vetting and how we can reduce the time frame for vetting. And also potentially how we can put that on the footing to be more of a commercial model. So it's got peaks and troughs. It inevitably will have peaks and troughs. But I think if you can get it right, often people will buy in our troughs, people will buy in the additional time. We have got some risk in this area, which is being managed in terms of compliance of vetting. And we will be previously, I think a couple of years ago, the force decided to stop its annual declaration process, which sat very uncomfortably with me. I think that's because it didn't really ever identify much, but it's not the point. It needs to make sure that people are focused and know that they're making a declaration. And the finance, as Sarah touched on slightly earlier, additional investment, 1.4 million a year, which is to augment our internal and external services. I suppose some key points were, one, the vetting team needed to grow. That was a non-negotiable fact. And also in terms of our capacity, in terms of PSD, which is not just about the investigative side. Some of it was the scoping of some of the complaints that came in and getting early interventions and early decisions, because it's something that, I'm really keen that we make the decisions as quick as we can, and some of it was feeling a little bit slow. So there's been an investment in there, which of course amounts to around about 1.4 million. And some of this is also to support our investigations around sexual harm prevention orders and criminal behaviour orders, which again are all preventative measures in order to curtail offending. So ultimately, the aim is to call out for the public, to everybody play a part in relation to this. I've always said that communities defeat terrorism. I think passengers can defeat unwanted sexual behaviour by calling it out. And it's about making sure that victims receive the service that we can provide of. And it's about ultimately making sure that we create a hostile environment for people who are using rail to commit their offending. But also the same, if we want to achieve that externally, we've got to have a force that looks itself in the mirror and make sure that it's equally a hostile environment for that sort of behaviour within our organisation. And I think I've been pretty clear on my messaging. Zainab is probably the best one to answer that. But I've pretty much said how I view that. So probably we've just got 5 minutes, Alistair. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Just a few points, I think you've covered nearly all of it, Lucy. I think just from a marketing point of view, to give some further assurance, coming in week 2 and having a look at the BTP's plans, I think it's fair to say that we're reasonably well advanced in comparison to other forces, quite frankly. And if you sort of split this down into internal and external activity, I think we've probably taken a little bit of a march on other forces nationally. So this is quite, I think, an advanced forward-thinking plan. Now that we've got sort of plan documented and written down, the next bit for us really is around how we flex resources to support it. So we touched on sort of PSD element, how we're going to do more vetting, internal victim support, etc. But only last week we started refocusing a lot of our proactive resourcing towards this agenda in the public domain, so on the networks. And just by way of example, 2 really good arrests last week by colleagues in London directly observing sexual offending on trains, so a great start. And arrest for those. Just the follow-up point for that, for us is now going to be non-negotiable around our focus on the judicial outcome stage where we go through the course. We must and will, with partners, apply for prevention orders to keep these individuals off the network. And that's a gap I think we have been missing. So there'll be a bit more work to do. Alan's pilots can work on that as well, just to make sure that the sort of impact statements and all the bits that are required are obtained. So I think this is a good plan. There's some enhancements we've added to it after the first meeting that we had. You know, Lucy's talked about the detection rate around 11%. We want to see that rise. One of the ways we'll do that is to enhance the victim service that we provide at the outset. So victim support, giving them the confidence to see it through to the end. And that's another area of investment from our detective. Overall, I think as a sort of foundation set forward, we're in good place.
Thank you. Any questions or points? Stella, then Martin, then Andy, please. Stella.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. I'm looking at 6.1, and I must say I was a bit shocked to see the figure of 30 officers on suspension. And I just wondered, well, I was shocked in a way because I don't think we've had that figure in previous years. And Stephanie, in your previous role in PSD, you'll remember, perhaps you'll have a better, recall of what the history of this is. But were you, Lucy, surprised by the number? And are these officers older officers who haven't had the recent training, which presumably focuses on this very area? I just wondered how, what the profile of those 30 officers were.
So they're not, Stella, it's probably the way it's written, they're not all suspended, so some of them are being investigated. So the suspension number is nowhere near as high as the 30, it's in sort of low single figures. Yeah, about 5 or 6 in terms of the actual suspensions. I think if you look at it proportionately, it's probably pretty reflective. I wasn't surprised about the number of people being investigated, disappointed, but not surprised. I think that what that means is, I feel the message is being heard quite strongly by people. I mean, Alistair's reaffirmed the message, I've reaffirmed the message. I mean, some of the positivity of this is that people are reporting unacceptable behaviour, some of it within the workplace, which has to be a positive. So if that number is to grow because we're seeing more reporting, then in a way I view that as a positive, because we need to uncover, some of the behaviours that people intimate still exist. Well, the way that we can stamp them out is by colleagues reporting it. And in fairness to both the union and the federation, they've been amplifying that message that it's unacceptable behaviour and it needs to be reported. I think the abuse of power, again, some of these are external facing ones, some of these are. So there's a mixture of age, mixture of what seems to be fueled it, people who have been out and about, had a drink, unacceptable behaviour on the way home, some of it probably quite measured, considered behaviour, which is completely unacceptable behaviour, but, not alcohol-induced, anything to do with that. So I think it's pretty reflective of society, Stella, I would say. It's a total mixture.
Okay, so
Thank you.
Martin.
Yes, thanks.
I think the juxtaposition and existence in the same paper of violence against women and girls and then behaviour of officers is quite an interesting and brave approach to take in some ways. I think I'm seeing that we've got to put our house in order if we're to have any credibility when it comes to actually policing the public in this area. So I just think that probably needs a little bit more clarification in terms of what that justification is actually saying to us. I think it's quite commendable that it's in the same paper, but it's just a bit confusing potentially. And I just wonder whether, and I now look at 6.2, I think towards the end, the last line or two, there is a risk reading that you could think that the responsibility for delivering training and in this area of responding and supporting victims is predominantly a professional standards departmental responsibility as opposed to leadership supervision. And it's quite clear it's there from the top because the two of you sat here today and talked about it and led from the top. But it's clearly that critical role of first line, second line supervisors and managers, as opposed to, and we had this bit with Stephen Lawrence, do we deliver race discrimination and other training from the training department, or do we deliver it through our sergeants and inspectors? And I see just echoes of that here. And I'm not seeing writ so large, the sergeant inspector role.
If I could just respond to that, I know Rachel's on here as well to comment, but we're out to embark on some senior leadership training. What I would like to see, and I've sort of seen in my previous force, is the leadership training extend down, right down to police constable, police staff equivalent around leadership. Because I think, by virtue of the role, police officers and staff are leaders, and we have a lot of investment and trust in them. The behavioural side of it, the conduct side, is what I think it does need to reach down through a leadership programme. So at some point, there needs to be discussion, in my view, around a leadership programme that engages every member of staff right down to the front line. So that will obviously capture the sergeants, inspectors, and police staff equivalent. But I think it's really, really important. I don't think we can stop at sort of superintendent spectrum, but it has to go down. It is about leadership.
Rachel, do you want to add something?
Yes, just to confirm, we are the tender stage actually for a senior leadership programme which will look at superintendent staff equivalents and above. That is very much based around our values and the behaviours we expect of senior leaders, looking at modern science, psychology, etc., of how you engage people. We're going to look at the same principles and put them in all our other leadership programmes, like Alistair said, that go down to sergeant level in due course. Today, I also had a meeting with our internal comms team this morning about a campaign about bystander behaviour and calling out poor behaviour and particularly sexualised behaviour. And we'll be rolling that programme, and so we're tackling this on all fronts, if that gives some reassurance to the board.
So there is a lot of work in this area. I mean, it's always a tricky one, isn't it? Please don't do X, Y, and Z. It's pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, I just sort of think, reaffirming standards right from when people are joining the organisation and people who have been in the organisation a long time and maybe have been passive around unacceptable behaviour. I mean, that's the difficulty that a lot of, I think, longer in service officers have, is that they sit there with a little bit of guilt around that. We all know times where potentially people have just ignored stuff that's unacceptable, and everybody has it's probably got more of a conscience today than they've ever had, but that's no different to any other organisation. It's just about empowering people to call out the unacceptable, and the leadership is very important. I mean, we devote 45 minutes now of Feb where we'll pick a particular topic to talk about, and it was quite palpable actually when we originally talked about this in the workplace, but the amount of victims we've got in our organisation, just generally, not necessarily behaviour inside but outside, it mirrors the sort of 80% probably. Can give you an example of it.
Good. Anything else?
No.
Sorry, yeah.
I'd like to build on the point Martin made about, putting in the internal stuff with violence and aggression. I think it's the right place for it to be. I agree with Martin, we need to be more explicit about it. But the reason it's the right place to be, whether it's internally or externally, it's violence and aggression against women. So I think, if we're that clear cut about it, it doesn't give people places to hide. So.
And it's quite an interesting title. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's been adopted as a general phrase, whether it be in government or wherever, violence against women and girls. We are actually talking about male violence against women, and that's what we're talking about. There just seems to be this complete, almost unwillingness to accept that we are talking about male violence.
Andy?
If I remember rightly, you're going to get some QC advice on employment status and discipline.
Yes.
I'd be wrong to share what you've been told, but have we got that now?
No, we've done the commission now. So Rachel, do you want to just explain where we're at in terms of getting QC advice around the employment status?
Yes, I've sent a commissioning note to the QC. He's been involved in a very difficult tribunal, so he sent a note back saying he will respond to us, but I haven't yet got his advice.
Sounds like a normal QC.
Is this on the basis of direct access, Rachel? Is this on the basis of direct access? You've gone straight to the SIL?
We've gone for some advice because I'd rather not say too much if you don't mind in
Sure.
this public meeting.
No, sure. No. Okay, that's fine. Anything else to discuss?
So Chair, if I may, we can't in the room see the chat bar, but I just know that Andy O'Dell from the Rail Delivery Group is echoing the Chief's frustration at the lack of. Andy O'Dell from, beg your pardon. Andy O'Dell from the Rail Delivery Group has echoed the Chief's frustration at the lack of uptake by TOCs on the Violence Against Women and Girls campaign. And just to echo or to note to those attending virtually, we cannot see the chat bar, and nor do we have the ability to bring it up. So if you do have any comments to make, please make them verbal.
Okay. Anybody, anything else? Or are we happy to note this report from Lucy? Yeah, happy to note. Thank you very much. We now come to a couple of verbal reports, for which by definition you have no papers for those reports. So the first one is the strategy 22-25 update. I think that's Simon. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Chair. So we've been working with the strategy steering group on the development strategy, in particular trying to work through the balance around GBR, how much sort of emphasis we should place on some of the imperatives around rail reform. The strategy steering group has given us some sort of excellent advice, which we've taken forward. And Lucy and the Chief Officer Group have been working on a draft of the strategy with the vision, purpose, mission, objectives, and the benefits that would flow from that. And that document is now, I'm pleased to say, at an advanced state. It's been circulated back to the strategy steering group, and Alistair and I are meeting the steering group members on Monday. We look forward very much to their feedback. We've also taken some consultative advice from professional communicators in terms of their view about the language and whether or not the language which is in the draft strategy would resonate with the various stakeholder groups, from passengers through to the industry. Alongside this, we are also at a pretty advanced stage in developing the portfolio, which will deliver against the strategic objectives. We've got a Chief Officer Group review with Lucy at the end of the week. We've gone through a series of pre-meetings with Alistair to ensure that the activities which are in that portfolio, we've got a very clear line of sight between the strategic outcomes and those activities, particularly mindful of the financial pressures that we discussed earlier. And the sort of final strand is working on the KPIs to ensure that as we, under Alistair, reset the performance regime, we ensure that that performance regime, again, is absolutely hardwired to our strategic objectives. So, subject to obviously the discussions that we have the strategy steering group next week, I think actually we're in, given the complexities of the strategic context and some of the uncertainties around rail reform, I think we're now in a pretty advanced stage to be able to draw these various elements together in this calendar month.
Thanks, Simon. Does anybody have any questions or points they wish to make? And we can tend to note this verbal update and that it's going to committee and there'll be further work on the strategy. Thank you. Item 12, I've got that down as Alan doing that.
So it'll be Sam.
So you're doing it, Sam, instead.
Thank you, Chair. Just really quickly, in the interest of time, just wanted to update you that the strategy committee saw a fairly well advanced first draft of the force-wide and local plans that will start next year. Those have been built on the back of a series of consultation meetings with stakeholders out in the regions. It also included initial findings from BTP's passenger survey activity that's ongoing. A draft of the force-wide plan and the plan for Scotland was also shared with the Scotland Committee, was it last week, a couple of weeks ago, for review and discussion. And I understand, I was hoping that Alan would be here to explain how far this has got, but I understand that the force is currently working on developing supporting measures and KPIs with a view to getting all of that information back to the executive either just before Christmas or very early in the new year so that we can launch our final consultation as we would normally do in January. So I think we're on track. I think we've got a fairly robust plan. The Chief made a very good point actually in the strategy committee about lack of representation in the BTP passenger survey. So we're working with Alan and the team to see if we can boost representation from the unrepresented voices. Could be that we can't do that through the strategy. So we're in discussion with the force around whether we could seek some advice maybe from the IAGs to help plug some of those gaps. So I think things are on track. Scotland Committee sees another draft in February. Strategy Committee will see a final draft in March, with a view to making a final recommendation to you for approval at the end of March. If members want any more detail, the paperwork is on BI in the meeting pack for the Strategy Committee meeting of 17th of November. Happy to take any questions, but that's where we are currently.
Any questions or points for Sam? Okay, thank you. We can note that, please. Thank you very much, Sam. We now come to an item a bit closer to home, board effectiveness evaluation. Lucy and Stephanie, how do you want to handle this?
That's me. Thanks, Ron. So as members are aware, this is an exercise in continuous improvement that you'll be very familiar with by now, and it just ensures that we take some time out each year to reflect on our ways of working. So this paper updates on progress against last year's plan, last year's plan that was agreed in June, and sets out the process for the 2022 exercise. So I shan't take up much of your time, but before I talk about the 2022 proposals, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on the progress that we've made from the last action plan and look at some of the key changes. So there was the oversight mapping work that was in progress, which we've moved forward. We've implemented the People and Culture Committee. We've brought back a chairs forum, which I think members have found really useful, and also added in the breakfast briefings as more of an informal educational opportunity as well. And I think we've really seen the benefits of all of this. We've had some really positive feedback on the last round of committees. So I think we can see those changes coming through and actually achieving what we wanted them to. So I think it's a really positive step forward. I think it also demonstrates, the value of having a dedicated board secretary as well in post, which was obviously one of the actions from the 2019 plan that we've really seen things improve. So moving on to what we're going to look at next year. So we're not proposing any radical change, but the key points to note are that we're revising the questionnaire. You've had a fairly standard one that was the NAO questionnaire that they recommend. So we're going to look at tailoring that more to where we are now. We're on a reasonable way through our improvement journey, recognising that it will never end. We're going to do interviews, but not on a one-to-one basis with everyone. We're going to look at questionnaires and pull out the areas we really want to explore, where there might be significant outliers, and delve into them. And then the new thing that we're introducing for this year is some focus groups. When we've done our thematic analysis and we've got our themes identified, then we're going to get some groups together to look at some of those bigger issues in more detail, or bigger opportunities in more detail. And then finally, we also are required to have independent input every 3 years. So we're at that point now. And as Hugh mentioned earlier, we've got the consultants coming in the new year to help us with our ways of working with the force in terms of our service level agreement, and also with the financial delegations. So we're going to roll that work into that, so it won't come at any additional cost. It should be within that piece of work. So that's where we are at the moment. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions or points for Lucy on the back of the paper and the recommendation?
I just wanted to draw out the 1st of February date, Lucy, which the paper mentions as the kind of time particularly allocated for board development. I think there are a lot for us to try and do on the 1st of February. You've got kind of what I might call ongoing, how is this year's action plan going, and how are we doing on the individual elements of it, which we should use the 1st of February for. I am rather hoping that there may be 5 new members of the authority with us on the 1st of February, at which point it's actually quite a significant kind of induction exercise as well. And then the third point, which I've yet to develop with Bob, would be a big element of it, is Sarah has recently tried to tie me down to have conversations about what we're here for, what is the whole authority here for, which sometimes members do come back to and say will be a good conversation to have. So I feel with 5 new members and that opportunity the 1st of February, we ought to try and do that as well. So you've got the whole kind of what we're here for, you've got 5 new members, and you've got, frankly, a fairly meaty agenda of the ongoing elements of the action plan. So quite a lot of work for us to get that all stood up for the 1st of February to help you get through it in a meaningful way. But I wanted to put that in your mind now so that you're ready for it. It's less than 2 months away.
Can I just say at this point, this paper is a distillation of considerable and continuing work on our behalf. And I think looking back over the last 2 or 3 years, the process, which is now, I think, fairly well embedded into our business cycle, is very useful, very helpful. And I would like to thank particularly Lucy and Stephanie for all the work they've put into this. And they produce a pretty good product, ladies, so thank you very much for that. Are we content to approve the recommendations in the paper? Yes. Yeah. Okay, green light, ladies, another shed load of work coming your way, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, we now turn to the committee minutes. The committee minutes have been in the pack, so you'll all have an opportunity to read them, and I don't require the committee chairs to just repeat verbatim the minutes, but it would be very helpful if they give any views that they might think might be useful to members. Can we start with you, Craig, performance and delivery?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As just mentioned, minutes are there. What people will notice over the last few meetings is the movement very much in line with what we discussed earlier on, to focus on legitimacy. Helpfully, before this meeting, we met as committee chairs with the new deputy, with Alistair, and talked about some things we want to do for the future, of which one is, are we getting the performance reporting right? There's a lot of volume there, but I think one of the things we're wrestling with is the insight collectively. So it's not about we need more data, it's the insight and the so what that we need to do more work on, but it's absolutely going in the right direction, and good, very good cooperation between the force and the authority and executive on this.
Thanks very much, Craig. Does anyone have any questions or points for Craig? Okay, Andrew, can we move on to you, please?
Yeah, SPC, I think we've covered all of the substantive points in today's agenda that were covered in the committee a couple of weeks ago, such as the policing plan and the budget and MTFP. We did discuss the strategy. I'm pleased to see that there's now something available that is now being reviewed and digested, which I'm sure we'll digest over the coming weeks as part of the process. So I'm really pleased that that's happened. But yeah, nothing else to add to this.
Thanks, Andrew. Anyone, any questions or points on that? Dan? Thank you very much. Beth, over to you, please.
Just a couple of things I wanted to draw to members' attention. One is the recognition agreement for superintendents, which has gone through now. I wanted to talk about family-friendly policies, because I think this is really important for the sort of employee relationship. So we now are offering 5 days paid pregnancy loss miscarriage leave to partner employees, and an increase in paternity leave to 3 weeks with pay. At the same time we did that, we've renamed paternity leave as partner parental leave. I think that's quite important. We're adopting some much more modern policies around the workplace. And at the same meeting, we discussed the psychological framework, really bringing together a much more coherent relationship between health, well-being and safety. And we welcome the Federation's undertaking mental health training. So really appreciative of that. We also did talk about sexualised behaviour, but I think we've done a lot on that. But I think the thing I really want to emphasise is why this committee is important, is we do make the linkages between leadership, values, psychological safety, and the culture, the internal culture, and how it impacts the external culture. And it's early days yet, but but I think we're all members, 4 sound members, are quite implacable about it. So it's important. Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions or points for Beth? We turn to you now, please, Kenneth.
Yeah, just 3 points I'd like to bring out from the last audit committee. The first one is for members to note that an audit on procurement had been completed in the period since the last meeting, excuse me, and that had achieved a substantial assurance rating. So I think that was very pleasing to see, and a subject as important and difficult as procurement, that had been achieved. I think that testament to a lot of the work that Tracy and her team had done in recent months and years. Second point was we'd received our first report on the Manchester inquiry, and I think it's fair to say the committee didn't feel quite satisfied that it gave them sufficient tie back to the recommendations that the inquiry had made, the two monitored recommendations, nor a sufficient forward look as to the anticipated progress of all the actions. And so we'd made some suggestions for some amendments to a report for the future, which I'm not sure have been passed yet to the force, but I'm sure they will consider them when they receive them. A third point is around risk management. As we said earlier, we made a request to accelerate the progress on the risk deep dives, and I'm pleased to hear that that has been accepted. And also good discussion with Alistair about how we can really sort of bring the risk management to life, because these are very all-encompassing risks, and they give us a really good opportunity to discuss the subjects that pertain to these risks. And I think Alistair's taken that away as well to consider that within the force. So that was all I wanted to cover. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Kenna. Anyone, any questions or points for Kenna? No, thank you very much. Bill.
Thanks, Ron. Much of what we cover at SRPC is similar to what we cover on this agenda. So we talked last time about sexualised behaviour, we talked about antisocial behaviour, we talked about face covering compliance and so on, much of which just mimics what we talk about here. In a more specific context, mentioned COP26 earlier, we spoke about that. We did a deep dive on estates and fleet, and I suppose it was interesting for members to get a look at what particularly the estate situation is in Scotland, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. Overall, I would say we get good participation involvement from Police Scotland. There's a lot of time spent talking about joint operations and joint work with Police Scotland, which is exactly what we want to hear. And there is, I don't recall any meeting recently where D Division and Police Scotland haven't gone off after the meeting to talk about something that they think they can share information and learnings on, which is exactly what we want to hear. So I appreciate everyone. There's a lot of work goes in from both the force and the executive to support us in that. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Bill. Any questions or points for Bill? Are we happy to note then the reports of all these committees? Yeah. Thank you very much. At this point of the agenda, the opportunity to raise any other business. Do any of my authority colleagues have any other business they would like to raise? I'll take that as a no. We've now reached the stage of the meeting where we go into private session. So Alistair, I'd like to call for the exclusion of all public and non-members. Oliver, obviously, if you wish to stay, you're very welcome so to do. Thanks very much.
Chairman, I take this opportunity